Good afternoon and welcome once again to Channel 514 as we continue our series exploring ancient literature, and we have two videos left to go, or at least that's the plan, on Egyptian literature before we move into Greek and Roman literature. And so what I was going to do in this video is talk about some of the later Egyptian tales and stories, so we're getting into more fictional literature, straightforwardly fictional, as opposed to mythological or something like that. And so these tales, as I said, they are later in origin than the ones we talked about in our video on the classics of the Middle Kingdom. So most of these date to the Middle Kingdom or the Third Intermediate Period or some later time like that. And the very latest of them all are the ones we're going to cover in our next video, and so that will probably be the last one. But without further ado, let's get right into this. So, as usual, we're using the Literature of Ancient Egypt from Yale University Press 2003, and the first of these tales that we're going to take a look at is sort of an obscure one known as the Quarrel of Apophis and Seknenre. And if you're familiar with Egyptian mythology, you may recognize the name Apophis, or Apep in Egyptian. Apophis is a Greek form. Is the name of the leader of these evil beings, these serpents that live in the primordial watery chaos and are adversaries of the gods. But in this tale, the Apophis, the character named Apophis, is the king of the Hyksos, and we have never talked about them in our series so far, and so I'll say just a few words about the Hyksos, and I will show a map so we can see where their kingdom was. So just a moment. So I had this marked because I made a version of this that I decided not to post, and hopefully I'll be able to find it again without any real trouble. Let me find the chapter on the Second Intermediate Period in here. This, of course, is the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, edited by Ian Shaw. I believe this edition is from '02. Here we are. So here's a map. Now the Hyksos are a Semitic people who controlled part of Egypt, namely the north and the central parts of the land, during the Second Intermediate Period, which would be circa 1650 to circa 1550 BC. So let me see if I can hold that up. You see in the eastern delta here you have a site called Tel El Daba. That's its modern Arabic name, and that is Avaris, which was the Hyksos capital. And so the regular old Egyptians, what were they doing at this time? Well, they had a kingdom at the city of Thebes, and that's in pretty big print there. Let me see if I can reach my finger to it. Here's Thebes. So the regular Egyptians are down here in Upper Egypt, and up here in Lower Egypt, and in the central areas you have the Hyksos kingdom. And so Apophis in our story is the Hyksos king. So there's a political overtone to this story about Egypt versus the Hyksos, of course, because these interloping foreign groups, the Hyksos, they were resented by the native Egyptians and eventually driven out of the land by the founder of the new kingdom, Ahmose I. But anyway, this story also has a strong element of the comic to it, and it's one of these stories, the like of which you find not infrequently in ancient Near Eastern literature and in the Bible and sometimes in Greco-Roman literature and mythology, in which one king sends emissaries to another king to propound some difficult problem or a puzzle or a question to the other king. And So it causes a stir because the king to whom the problem is sent doesn't know how he's going to solve it, and he'll be embarrassed if he can't solve it. And so one of his more brilliant associates, the hero of the story, is always the one to solve the problem. And so that seems to be the premise of this story, the Quarrel of Apophis and Seknenre. But I say there's an element of the comic to it, because the problem that the Hyksos king is propounding is the fact it's about hippos. So the problem is that the hippopotamuses, or hippopotami if you like, in Thebes, the regular Egyptian capital in the south, are making so much noise at night. I don't know if hippos make noise in reality, maybe that's the joke here, or part of the joke, but they're making too much noise, and the Hyksos king wants someone to figure out how they can make less noise. And so the story breaks off before it really goes anywhere besides this basic premise. And so you can guess, though, that it has to do with the Egyptians outdoing or outwitting their rivals, the Hyksos in the north. But interestingly, both kings address each other by traditional, well, in a traditionally pharaonic style or form. So they use this formal language like, to the king may he, to whom be life, prosperity, and health, which is always abbreviated LPH. So they address each other as brother kings almost. And so that's the Quarrel of Apophis and Seknenre. Seknenre, the native Egyptian king, I forgot to look up his dates or his dynasty on Wikipedia before doing this, but I would guess that it would have to be between 1650 and 1550 BC, so possibly the 16th or 17th dynasty or somewhere thereabouts. Anyway, after that, we have a tale called The Capture of Joppa. Joppa being a town in Palestine or on the Levantine coast, and today it's known as Jaffa, Jaffa, but in ancient literature it's usually called Joppa. And so in this tale there's a prince of Joppa called the Rebel of Joppa in our story, and he rebels against the conquering Egyptian king, Thutmose III, who is illustrious for his military victories. And Thutmose III isn't one of the great New Kingdom pharaohs. He is an 18th dynasty pharaoh. And so in this story he sends a deputy, he sends a general to defeat Joppa, to capture the city, and so they're unable to capture it because the Rebel of Joppa is so brilliant, or he's unbeatable, or the city is very well defended, or whatever. And so I believe what they end up doing is, that's right, they pretend that they're going to give tribute to the Rebel of Joppa. They're going to send him gifts, and in a sort of Trojan horse situation, they end up sneaking soldiers into the town, including the general himself, I think, and he takes the Rebel of Joppa prisoner, and I think he actually slays him or subdues him using this royal mace that the king has given him as an emblem of his power. In Egyptian art, you often see the king being represented as crushing his foes, crushing some kind of rebel with a mace, and restoring order to the land. So that's sort of a very iconic traditional image in Egyptian culture. And so that's the close of the capture of Joppa, and so Egypt wins, and so we have a happy ending from an Egyptian perspective. But the next of these is a much more fanciful story, also from the New Kingdom, called The Tale of the Doomed Prince. And at the very beginning of this story, or at least, so in the very beginning of this story, this young prince is born to the king of Egypt, and who should appear at his birth but these 7 goddesses, the 7 Hathors. And what they do in Egyptian literature is appear at the birth of some important person, and they say something, they foretell something about the life or the death or the destiny of that person. And so the 7 Hathors, they say about this prince that he's going to be killed by one of 3 animals, either a dog or a snake or a crocodile, but not all 3, one of them. And so the king is determined to stop this from happening, and so he orders that his son should be brought up in close confinement, and I believe he's in a tower or something like that. And so at one point the son is out on the roof with his pedagogue or someone, and he sees a greyhound, and he thinks that's just the greatest thing he's ever seen, and so they end up having to give the young prince a greyhound, and I guess they choose one that's very well trained or from a good pedigree that they can hope is not going to kill the prince. But so now he has a greyhound, and he then wants to go out and have adventures, and so he gets more and more out of the close confinement in which he's being raised. And so he goes to the land of Kor, Khor, Syria, and at this time during the New Kingdom, Kor, or Syria, was often under Egyptian control. And so he goes to a land called Naharin, and I'm not sure where that would be on a modern map. It's known where it is, I just can't bring it to mind right now. But he goes there, and there's this royal lady there, this princess, and she also is being confined in a tower. And the terms of that arrangement are that if one of the princes of the land can jump all the way up to the window of the tower, then they can marry her. But of course they can't do it, but the Egyptian prince can do it because he's better than them, and so he leaps to the window and he marries this princess. And so after that it turns out that she's a clever sort, and so when a snake comes into their house and wants to bite the prince in his sleep, she knows just what to do. And of course, what do you do when a snake is about to bite someone in their sleep? Well, you have to get the snake intoxicated to the point where it's incapacitated and then hack it to bits. And so this princess puts bowls of wine or beer in front of the snake, and this is apparently the kind of snake that likes fermented beverages, so the snake drinks the wine or the beer and becomes torpid or falls asleep or something, and she hacks it to bits. And so after that, the prince ends up in a situation where he's swimming or something like that, and there's the crocodile that's been following him all his life, like Captain Hook or something. The crocodile is doing battle with some kind of water spirit, and the crocodile, I think, makes a deal with the prince that he'll spare him if he helps him defeat the water spirit, but the text breaks off before it comes to an end, and so we don't know what happens later in the story, if they manage to break the curse or if the prince falls victim to the curse or something. But that's the tale of the doomed prince, so you can see why I describe that as more of a fanciful story than the previous 2. But although hippos and everything, I mean, that first one was pretty fanciful when you think about it. But after that, in this book, we have the tale of the 2 brothers, and I talked about that one in our video on the later mythological texts, and so I don't think we need to return to it here. And then also there's the contendings of Horus and Set, and we talked about that in our video on the Osirian classics, and so we'll skip that also. The next one after these is known as The Blinding of Truth by Falsehood, or simply The Blinding of Truth. And it's an allegorical tale in which you have 2 brothers, one named Truth and the other named Falsehood. And of course the brother named Falsehood is out to destroy his brother or out to get the better of his brother. And so at the very beginning of our story, or where it picks up, because the beginning is lost, but at what is to us the beginning, where it picks up, the two brothers are standing before the Aenead, the 9 gods of Heliopolis, who are sitting in judgment over them, and Falsehood is blaming his brother for having stolen a dagger from him that he describes in a fantastic way. So obviously he's Falsehood, so he's lying about it. He's falsely accusing his brother. So he says, "A dagger of which the mountain of Ale forms the blade, of which the woods of Coptos form the haft, of which the god's tomb forms the scabbard, and of which the herds of Kal form the belt." So it's almost as if half the whole world is part of this dagger, so obviously it's not real, but the gods decide in favor of Falsehood. They're taken in by him, and so they order that his brother Truth be blinded and cast out. But it turns out that a woman, I believe it's supposed to be Falsehood's wife or just some local woman, who herself must have some allegorical significance, but she comes upon Truth in his blinded state, and she lies with him and has a son by him. And so her son is... Oh, and she also arranges that he should be her doorkeeper. He should become her doorkeeper. And so, I guess that's a job a blind person can do. And so she is raising her son without a father, so her son is being taunted by the other boys, and so he goes to his mother and asks who is his father, and she tells him it's the blind doorkeeper. And so he then talks to Truth about his life story, his predicament, and he decides he's going to beat the wicked brother Falsehood at his own game. And so he goes and visits Falsehood, and he has an ox, a beautiful ox that he leaves with Falsehood's men, his herdsmen. And Falsehood, of course, is just so nefarious that he steals the ox that's been entrusted to him and has it prepared for dinner. And so the boy comes back, and they tell him that they don't know anything about his ox, so he goes to the Aenead and has them again sit in judgment as a tribunal, and he beats Falsehood at his own game by pretending that his ox was so fantastic that if it stood up, its legs would be in the Nile and its horns would be in the mountains or something like that, that it's just so fantastically huge and wonderful that there's no replacing it. And so the gods punish Falsehood by having him blinded, and he then has to serve as a doorkeeper to his brother. And so that's the blinding of Truth by Falsehood. And now we got a couple more here. There's one called Astarte and the Insatiable Sea, which is sort of a mythological text that I skipped in our video where it would have appeared on the later mythological texts, because it seems to actually be a sort of Ugaritic or Near Eastern, Levantine type of story about Astarte, obviously a Phoenician or a Levantine goddess. And so what's she doing in this Egyptian story? Well, that's really not so strange a thing, because there often were large Semitic populations dwelling in Egypt, and particularly in the north, and especially in the New Kingdom. And the kings of that era tended to regard this presence of the Asiatics or whatever as sort of a social problem that they themselves were called to rectify or address somehow. So it seems like in this story Astarte is somehow at law with the sea, which is Insatiable, of course, and the sea apparently wants her daughter, and so you can see this is sort of one of these Near Eastern goddess myths about a goddess and a sky god or a sea god or something like that, and there's some sort of fertility story or something involved, but in any case, it's actually pretty fragmentary, and I don't think we need to really say much about it. Well, our translator in his introduction, this is Edward F. Wendt Jr., one of the 4 translators in this volume, but he says, "It is likely that this story of a conflict between the gods and the sea is an adaptation of a Ugaritic tale of the fight between Baal and the sea god Yam," and he refers to a book by a German scholar and a scholar named Theodore H. Gaster. Well, 1 or 2 books that would have something to do with this. Okay, one of these suggests that the Egyptian text was inspired by the Hurrian Song of Ulikumi, and I never mentioned the Hurrians in our Mesopotamian videos, but they are one of these groups that migrated into Mesopotamia at some point in the long history of that region, and I believe they're the ones credited with introducing the horse to Mesopotamia, but I'm not 100% on that. But anyway, let's move on. The next one is called A Ghost Story, and as Edward F. Wendt Jr. says, it lacks the spooky quality that moderns associate with this genre of literature. So it's not a story about a ghost terrorizing someone, it's a story where a ghost appears to a high priest and asks that his personal mortuary cult be restored or enriched somehow, and so the high priest promises to make offerings and libations to the ghost, to the shade of this person, and there's not much more to it than that, but the tale apparently is from the Ramesside period, so from the reign of Ramesses the First or the Second or the Third. I believe there were 3 kings with that name, maybe 1 more, but anyway, it's from that period during the 19th dynasty, so the latter part of the New Kingdom, getting on towards the 13th, 12th, maybe the 11th century BC. Anyway, the last of these that I'm going to talk about is the Report of Wenamon, and this is a personal favorite of mine. And this story comes down to us from the 20th or the 21st dynasty, apparently, or it at least purports to be from that time. And the 20th dynasty is the last in the New Kingdom, whereas the 21st is the first in the 3rd intermediate period. And so what happens in this story is that the cult of Amun, which, as I mentioned in a previous video, was the most powerful religious institution during the New Kingdom, its power and its influence and its prestige, and that of its high priest, was comparable to the power and prestige of the king or of the monarchy and in general. And so we find, though, that things have come to a bad pass because the cult of Amun has this ceremonial boat that's used to carry the image of the god, and it's old and worn out, and so they need new Lebanese cedar wood to build a new boat. And so the king sends a delegation to the Levantine coast to get this wood, somehow procure it, and the delegation is led by a character named Wenamon, an associate of the king. And so in former times, when Egypt was either in control of this region or was a power to be reckoned with, or a power that could inspire terror or intimidate its contemporaries, they could probably have just come and taken the wood, or they could have bought it very easily and everyone would have gone out of their way to help. But at this point in their history, that's not so anymore, and so they have to go out of their way themselves to get the wood, and no one really wants to cooperate with them or help them. And so I believe first they're in Byblos, or Gubla, one of the great Phoenician cities, and the leading citizens of Byblos are not cooperative, and so they have trouble there. But they also go to a city called Dor, D-O-R, and in some old Bibles or older translations of ancient texts that mention this city, it's called Dora with an A on the end. But anyway, this is the home of the Jekker, T-J-E-K-K-E-R, or T-J-E-K-E-R, and the Jekker are one of the Sea Peoples, and I've never mentioned them in one of these videos, but the Sea Peoples are a pretty broad-based group of peoples or elements in Egyptian and Near Eastern and Mediterranean society who banded together and went on the warpath and apparently caused a lot of trouble around the turn of the 12th century BC. And they're credited with dealing devastating, or if you like, mortal blows to a lot of the great kingdoms and powers of that time. And so, of course, all the particulars are debated or debatable, and really we don't know all that much about the Sea Peoples, but they're referred to by that name in an Egyptian text somewhere, and there's a famous relief sculpture that shows one of their fighters, and so they've gone down in history as the Sea Peoples. And there are a lot of them, really. Some of them are supposed to have settled in Asia Minor or Sicily or Sardinia. Of course, the Philistines or Peleset of the Bible ended up on the western Palestinian coast, and the name Palestine, of course, derives from the name Philistines or Peleset. But anyway, the Jekker of Dor are another of these groups, and their leader, their leading citizen, Jekker Baal, he doesn't want to help the Egyptians. They have more trouble with him. Wenamon and his friends, they have more trouble with this guy. And so it seems like they're having this long, difficult, embarrassing journey, and isn't it sad that Egypt has come to such a pass? But ultimately we have a happy ending because they make, with some difficulty, with great difficulty, they make it back, and they're able to restore Amun's boat, and so Egypt saves face. And so you can guess that this story probably served to rally the flagging spirits of Egyptians in their sunset age, so to speak. And so those are the stories that I wanted to talk about in this video. Now, in the very next one, which will be our last on Egyptian literature, we'll talk about some even later stories from, I believe, mainly from the Ptolemaic period, or a little bit earlier, or a little bit later than that. But these last ones, I think, will be more easily appreciated, or more accessible, or have maybe an easier appeal to a modern audience, because they really have more of a Western or Hellenistic sensibility than the earlier Egyptian literature. And so I think that should be a fun one, or at least I'll have fun with it, and I hope you will too. But we'll be doing that pretty soon. So thanks for watching this one. I'll leave it at that, and we'll be seeing you soon. So have a great weekend and a great day.